your book also makes a very compelling case. Gives a holistic picture of non-kinetic counterterrorism approaches.
This is what I mean when people ask me what's your book about. Then I say it's about suicide terrorism and why people do what they do, and then I'm asked, so then why do they do it? And I'm like, I can't answer that. My book doesn't answer that. It attempts to explain to you the puzzle. There is this othering of terrorists as bad guys. Yeah, they are bad guys, that's fine, but can we try to understand what has led them to that point?
But as an author, what do you feel the impact of your book has been?
People in the armed forces and students ideally are the people who would make for the target audience, because policymakers, I feel, in our country especially, are more or less aware of this reality and are working in that direction. And also, it's not a policy prescription, this book. So it's more to understand especially for people who perhaps have a very army or military or statutory kind of approach, to make them just think and pause a little bit.
Welcome to a new episode of Books and Banter, a segment of the Dialoguers which celebrates authors, writers, and thought influencers. Today we have with us Ms. Radhika Halder, an author and geopolitical risk analyst with over a decade of experience spanning academia, policy research, and Fortune 500 environments. She is the author of Understanding Suicide Terrorism, which was published by the Routledge in 2019, and specializes in South Asia security, counterterrorism, and geopolitical risk analysis. Currently, she works in corporate security. Her work bridges research and practice through policy engagement, public speaking, and cross-sector collaboration. Welcome to the show, Radhika.
Thank you, Portia. Thank you for having me.
We will start by giving an idea of what your core essence of your book is. Radhika's book, Understanding Suicide Terrorism, traces the historical evolution of suicide as a tactic, situates modern suicide terrorism within ideological and organizational contexts, and emphasizes that the phenomenon is multidimensional, combining both psychology, symbolism, organizational strategy, and political objectives. So tell us, Radhika, what personal and professional experiences inspired you to focus your research on suicide terrorism? And how did that initial curiosity evolve into a full-length book?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for also the introduction of the book. I think I was personally motivated to kind of ask the question as to why do people do what they do. From a very young age, I was around 8 or 9 when 9/11 happened, and I was also in San Francisco at the time. My family and I were there. So it felt like a first-hand account. I was obviously not in New York, but close enough. My school was shut, the country kind of shut down, and America had changed overnight. And witnessing that as a very young, impressionable child was quite intense, but it really was something that I couldn't grasp or put my head around. Up until then, I used to think that the worst thing that can happen is probably climate related, an earthquake, or like anything that is not man-made. And so I was coming to terms with the fact that this is a really big bad world that we live in. So it started as that, like as a child, and growing up, I think that question always bothered me a little bit, that what happens, why do people resort to sort of violence of this extent? What is it that they're achieving, or what is it that they're aiming to achieve? And is there anything that comes out of it? How do we respond to it? So personally, it was more of that kind of a curiosity and question that I mean, looking back, I realized that that is what happened, in the personal space. And then professionally, I always wanted to study international relations because geopolitics was something that was close, it just seemed like it made sense to me. Having grown up in different parts of the world, it felt like something that came naturally to me. But within that, security studies and counterterrorism especially was the area that I felt like I wanted to focus on. This book in particularly, the reason why I went for it was also because I felt that in South Asia or in India especially, that we have a lot of scholarship on terrorism and on security, but it is somehow it will focus more on the organizations rather than terrorism as an academic discipline as such, if I can say so. Mostly we've had to rely on Western scholars to explain to us the concept of terrorism. And in India, I felt like the books or the scholarship was more, it was focused more on either Pakistan-based terror organization. It was always based on a terror organization and dissecting it, not terrorism as a concept or suicide terrorism as a psychological sort of interplay of terrorism, right? So I felt the need to also have something that talks about terrorism in the South Asian context. And it was the time at 2016 is when I was beginning to write this book. It was the heydays of the Islamic State, and the world was looking for answers, especially the European world was, I think, looking at India for answers as to how do you tackle sort of homegrown terrorism or terrorism that's very close to your borders. And that's also when I felt that as an Indian scholar, I think I also want to work in this direction and try to deconstruct terrorism as a concept as in an academic sense, and then of course look at how to go about it and the different aspects of it. So yeah, that's a very long answer to your question, but those are all the kind of thought processes I was having when I was beginning this project. Yeah.
I'm glad that you gave a long answer, because anybody who hadn't met you in person or wouldn't know, it's quite a deep topic for a young person to write. So the fact that you said that this has been inspiring you since you were a child makes a lot of sense, because you've without realizing or subconsciously have been affected by the concept, and your knack for studying international relations, I think, has just added more flavor to it. Having said that, in foreign policy circuit or the academia circle, we've spoken to a lot of people, and on and off, when such topics come up, of course, your book is referred to, which is wonderful. Congratulations. But having said that, several readers have also noted that your the quantitative, the empirical grounding is more of focused on South Asia in the book. So how would you assess that, to what extent is your analytical framework could travel to other regions, for instance, say Middle East or, Sub-Saharan Africa? And what modifications, if at all, you would do to consider necessary changes, keeping the context in mind?
Yeah, so I think, since it's been 10 years since I started this project, and looking back, when you look at anything you've written, let alone, even an article, let alone a book, you feel like you could modify it so much more. And so every time I look at the book also, it's really difficult, because I would have done it differently today and, every day hereafter. I think you rightly mentioned, right? It is sort of a book that is in the South Asian context, because that's what I wanted it to be. I wanted it to look more at sort of looking at the world, but seeing how that impacted terrorism in South Asia, especially suicide terrorism. I would do many things differently, especially because right now the research was more qualitative, because I couldn't really gather a lot of quantitative data. I was working with the Center for Air Power Studies when I was working on this, and so my access to sort of primary sort of sources of information would be limited. So I had to rely on secondary sources, on books, on people who worked closely in counter-terror operations, but that was as close as I could get to the subject. So I would, of course, I would try to gather more primary research if I could. And of course, it's difficult. You can't really, talk to a terror organization or a terrorist. But I feel like I had a lot of restrictions, just because of also where I was working, as well as just generally my age at the time. I wasn't really aware of how much deeper I could delve into like gathering data. But I feel like the qualitative part is there, but the quantitative part I would have focused on a lot more.
Considering your book was published in 2019, which was pre-COVID, and also that during COVID, a lot of people realized or started valuing data more, and data sets, and data analytics became like a more of a trend thing, which was unheard of, even though the work was being done. Uh, if you had access to larger data sets, do you think some of your findings would have been different? Do you think what your current findings are would have been applicable differently for a larger quantitative data set, which you couldn't get at that point of time?
Yeah, to a great extent. I think I was leaning a lot more on research that's out there, but sort of done in different parts of the world, and I was trying to apply, I mean, not, I was trying to suggest that that is the case in South Asia as well, and I was using case studies of different terror organizations to prove my point. Had I had a lot, of data or access to data, I would be able to prove my point without perhaps using so many case studies. It would just be a clear indicator of, these are some of the findings that we see in other regions, but also in South Asia as well. And I think that's also why other regions have findings that are more concrete, or it's just the data that speaks for itself. It's also harder to access that in South Asia, I feel, and also to have data that's more up to date, especially in this region.
Just a personal kind of a take on this. Do you think it would have been more appropriate had the maybe a tagline to your title would have been a case study of South Asia? Would that make more sense? Because I think you have taken case studies in your, the two specific chapters on case studies. Had it been, a case study of South Asia would have been more a comprehensive picture of your overall findings, which are actually brilliant, because South Asian terrorism, as we understand, obviously it is, cannot be defined till date because everybody has a perspective to it. But in the South Asian context, your findings are amazing. And maybe if it had said, a case study of South Asia, or your perspective, South Asian perspective, it could have given a more comprehensive picture.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I mean, I think the title doesn't indicate that the book is focusing on a region, but yeah, that was my intention, to focus on this region and kind of, look at, lean on the experiences around the world to explore.
And it's actually amazing because you've traveled the world, you've experienced a lot of things when you were in the West, and sitting there and being an Indian yourself, it was a very different way of understanding what was happening in South Asia. I think that has also given you a lot of lead on to kind of analyze a lot of situations. Moving on, your book also makes a very compelling case. Gives a holistic picture of a non-kinetic counterterrorism approaches. How would you translate these broad recommendations into concrete, measurable programs, and what indicators should policymakers use to evaluate their effectiveness?
So that was actually the intention of the book, was to eventually lead myself in that direction, where this is kind of a groundwork for understanding the problem, understanding the puzzle, not necessarily solving it. So when I usually tell people that this is what, when people ask me what's your book about, then I say it's about, suicide terrorism and why people do what they do. And then I'm asked, so then why do they do it? And I'm like, I can't answer that. My book doesn't answer that. It attempts to explain to you the puzzle, because I feel like the puzzle is so misunderstood, right? There is this othering of terrorists as bad guys. Yeah, they are bad guys, that's fine, but can we try to understand what has led them to that point, and understand that it's not like they live on another planet or in another colony, right? They're amongst us. So is there a way of perhaps also identifying individuals before they resort to an extreme form of political violence? And that was my that's what I was convinced of towards the end of my research, that we have to look more at perhaps countering the ideology, and therefore I talk about the shift from the global war on terror to countering violent extremism, trying to counter the ideology, the propaganda, the base of, all where the ideology lies as well. I mean, in the book, I've explored a few de-radicalization programs from different countries. I won't be able to say which country has done the best. Also, it's been a while since I've kind of kept up with the topic in the way that I was in the academic world. But I do feel like this book is just the entry point into exploring how de-radicalization programs, but also preventing not just countering violent extremism, but also preventing it before it leads into extremist political violence. Programs that are directed at that, and I mean, I think we're doing way better than where we were in 2016. We don't see acts of, I mean, at least in South Asia, I can say that we, of course, I won't say terrorism is over. It's never going to be eradicated. It's just like crime. But we will get better at strengthening the mechanism to intercept and prevent to the extent possible. And I feel like we are all going in that direction. There's a huge role to play for intelligence sharing. Different countries also share more intel now than they did at least a decade or two ago. But yeah, I won't say one particular program or this is how it should this is the program that is going to fix all problems. I feel like it's just important to remember the context and the setting, and to remember that there are certain conditions, socioeconomic or political, that have led to individuals resorting to an extreme form of violence. And as long as we remember that in our counter-terror efforts, we will always be able to better identify how to prevent and counter it. That's, like basically what I wanted to end the book with, and say that, okay, now if I want to explore how we go about that, that would perhaps be my next book or like a PhD. That was my idea behind the project as well.
Just to complement what you just said, I mean, I think the fact that you've taken a very non-military approach and a more of a sociological approach in, penning this book down, it makes a lot of difference, because, you worked in a military organization while doing this book, and you are a civilian yourself, you've experienced. So I think you had your your experience well established before, authoring this, and rightly so. You've done a very good job in, I think, covering the perspectives in which one should understand the context before reading this book, because normally people, with the term terrorism or suicide would immediately, relate it to very statutory aspects and, very organizational perspectives to understanding the situation. But to look at it from a very sociological perspective is a very rare way of understanding it, because like you said, somebody could it's important to understand what led them there, more than why and how the act was done. Why did they do this? And I think those are the questions you have posed in this book, which answers well. But as a reader, I would say, I think that the book comes across more as a foundation or an introduction to the concept, more than a comparative analytical kind of a thing. But as an author, what do you feel the impact of your book has been? Is there like a particular age group you think this would appeal more to, or do you think people in different governments or different organizations would use to understand? How do you think has been the impact of the book on the society in general?
Yeah, so I've heard back from people usually who are, because the circles that I'm usually going to, conferences or academic sort of circles, I hear back from people who are either studying security or counterterrorism, or people who are in the armed forces. And like you said, it does provide a foundational idea of suicide terrorism in the South Asian context, which was my intention. We've also, while I was at CAPS, while I was writing the book as well, we were speaking to school children, class 10, class 12, also sometimes college students. And so I feel like this is also important for, it would be a good insight for people, for kids who are growing up in, and kids today are growing up with the reality of ISIS, which is way more brutal, right? For us, of course, 9/11 growing up was a big thing for us, and it was a once in a blue moon, this is an extraordinary sort of event. But today, the kids that are growing up, and at that time, you know, the class 10 and 12 students were very sort of aware of the brutal acts of terrorism. It wasn't something that was taking them by surprise. And so I think for them as well to just be able to contextualize why this happens. And again, as when you're growing up, it's easier to call the terrorist a bad guy and just go on with your day. And the idea was to kind of give more context. So, I mean, yeah, ideally, I think those are the target audiences. I don't think, like you said as well, right, the non-kinetic measures are not to say that they are going to replace the kinetic measures. It's
Correct.
just an effort to say that we have invested a lot in the kinetic measures. Maybe let's also put some attention on the non-kinetic part, right? That it was just kind of, that was the effort. And so people in the armed forces and students ideally are the people who would make for the target audience, because policymakers, I feel, in our country especially, are more or less aware of this reality and are working in that direction. And also, it's not a policy prescription, this book. So it's more to understand from, especially for people who perhaps have a very army or military or statutory kind of approach, to make them just think and pause a little bit. So, yeah.
That's important. Sometimes when we are kind of amidst our schedules that we don't pause to think, and that changes a lot of it on the perspective. Just to make it interesting, if you could just briefly tell us, how do you plan to build on the arguments that you have the book? You mentioned on doing PhD, having written this book about, starting to write this book 10 years ago. Do you think there are certain research directions that these arguments would take you towards, and what are your future plans?
Yeah, for sure. Like I said, I think, I mean, I don't have a clear plan, but I know that I will get to it at some point. Because, like I said, the curiosity and the question of this puzzle always kind of is inherently bothering me. And again, it's not a puzzle that can have an easy answer, but you can look at different parts of it and try and attempt to understand it better. And I think my effort would be either to look, like we spoke about, the, you know, de-radicalization or the post effects of, like, how does it inform policy decisions or programs that can prevent it. But also I have found that taking some time after the book and kind of moving myself a little away from terrorism, I was focusing, I also spent some time in Nepal, and that's where I realized that terrorism is also a symptom of a lot more that's happening, right? It is one part of this very big puzzle, a bigger puzzle. So I think my direction can either be going into what happens before or what happens after. So understanding the ingredients and the vulnerabilities of states, which is also one of the chapters, of what leads to, like I said, acts of extreme violence or extremism, but also understanding the post. What can we do afterwards? What can we do in a country like Afghanistan now, right? What can we do afterwards where we can ensure that, I guess, there's no relapse, and also to understand that now, I think since this book was written 10 years ago already, you will see that terrorism has changed as we know it. At that time, the ISIS-style lone wolf attacks were the flavor of the season, and that's all we were hearing about. And now we don't hear necessarily the same style of sort of terror incidents. Again, it's not to suggest that terrorism isn't a reality anymore, but that it's mutated, like, you know, any infection or virus does. And so we also, along with that, have to keep mutating our understanding and evolving. So I really don't know exactly where it is that my next sort of, or whether it's a PhD or my next part of understanding the puzzle will be. Like currently I work in a very different space. I'm in corporate security. It's a little further removed from terrorism, but it's still closely aligned to security and understanding how geopolitics and security issues impact the world. So I think, yeah, I mean, part of being a curious scholar is to always keep learning. I won't be able to give you an exact answer, but it'll be something along the lines of that, what I've discussed today. And hopefully I'll be able to either convert it into a, more formal academic piece. Yeah.
Thank you, Radhika. It was great having a conversation with you, and wish you the very best for your future research on this topic. It's a very pertinent one in today's time. That was the author of Understanding Suicide Terrorism, Ms. Radhika Halder.